That was a sonata by Domenico Scarlatti, one of the most outstanding harpsichordists of his age. Born in the same year as Bach and Handel, Scarlatti wrote over 550 little sonatas such as you have just heard. This demonstrates something very special about the music of the 18th century. The artist's willingness to subscribe to a model and the listener's ability to grasp the essential passages of time in that model in order to enjoy and appreciate what was very unique about each recreation of that model, the special, fresh ideas that the composer would give to each little piece. You will perhaps noticed in the course of that composition that the sonata was divided into passages of time. And these blocks of time passing were marked, articulated by silences. The music came to a full stop halfway through. This bisection of the music into two equal divisions of time passing marks one of the principal achievements of musical classicism, namely a musical architecture of time passing that would become the hallmark of the music of the Age of Reason. This series of programs is about the two chief forms of music evolved in 18th century musical classicism, the Minuet and Trio and sonata form. We will be hearing how Beethoven, Haydn, Mozart invigorated these forms with their own special musical personalities. How this achievement of musical architecture, the articulation of time passing, contrasts to that achievement of the first half of the Age of Reason in music, the Contrapuntal Art of Bach, a music of linear continuity, forms which consist of musical processes of line and contrapuntal games. In the final program, you will hear how in the 19th century these forms were continued but bent, shaped for the purposes of Romanticism's musical poetry. Let's consider the basic forms of tonal musical architecture. We can demonstrate these with a series of constructions. First of all, simple binary form. We know these forms from our musical heritage of folk song. For example, you know this, perhaps this Voyageur song. La 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 la. Now, if you take that structure apart, you'll find that we are working in what we call simple binary form. The first half, la 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 la, and then a second half, la 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 la. What unifies these two halves is both the quality, the vigor of the song, and also a certain basic rhythmic pattern. Ta 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 ta. The series of pitches, that is the melody, is what differentiates the two halves of the work. But those halves are clearly bisected by a silence in time. Simple binary or two-part form. La 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 la. La 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 la. The other basic form which we know from our folk music and which becomes the principal foundation for the music of the Age of Reason, is the so-called modified ternary form. Here we have a bisection in time which looks like this. Perhaps you know this French-Canadian folk song. La 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 la. Repeated. La 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 la. Then something fresh, something different. La 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 la. And then a repeat of the first material. La 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 la. This bisection in time, then, dividing the music into two equal sections of time passing, is the fundament, the absolutely rudimentary musical architecture from which the Minuet and Trio and later the sonata form of Western music's 18th century classicism would grow. Let's feel that again. La 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 la. Exact repeat. La 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 la. Something fresh. La 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 la. Repeat. La 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 la. Modified ternary form. We say it is modified ternary form because we are dealing with a principle of recurrence, that is the last phrase relating to the material we heard at first, and yet we still feel that binary sense, that bisection in the music, which you see graphically represented in front of you. Now, this becomes such a familiar part of our Western folk music constructions that we become very, very much used to it. And we can begin to feel these then, not in their component divisions, but in larger time blocks. La 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 la. La 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 la. We feel the bisection, we feel the recurrence. It is part of our musical inheritance, and it is part of our growth, almost intuitive sense of what simple musical architecture should be, that musical recurrence should be a fundamental part of our listening experience, that which satisfies us, and we feel a sense of completion about such music. And so, that affords a clue in itself to why the music of Mozart, of Haydn, of Beethoven satisfies so much of our expectations about music. Something is set up that is repeated, we depart from it, and that sense of departure is heightened in its excitement for us by the fact that we know that there must return that initial material. The bisection, that central point of silence, marks then the opportunity for us to gather up in our minds the melodies, harmonies, and rhythms that we have experienced, be prepared to forsake them for a while, to depart from them or to play with them, and then, as I say, in heightened expectation, to return, and that sense of completeness as our former experiences are revived for us, and we feel that we have had a satisfying musical experience. Such a form is also then at the root of the Mozart structures, the Haydn structures, which we call Minuet Structure. You know the minuet from the Little Night Music Serenade of Mozart, Eine kleine Nachtmusik, which we can then go through this process again. Da dum bum bum ba da ding dun dun da 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 dum bum 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 dum bum bum. It repeats. Da dum bum bum ba da dum bum bum da 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 dum bum 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 ba. Something fresh, a contrast instead of the vigorous action, a smooth line. Da dee da 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 da. And then we return to the first idea. Dee bum 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 dee bum bum. One complete unit, which represents then as the sense of logic, that sense of balance, first half of inner divisions repeated, equaling the second half of excursion and return. And from that type of structure then is built the first of the larger forms of time passing in the 18th century. That is the Minuet and Trio, in which you have musical material set out in the form that I mentioned. That material is repeated at the end of the work, and in the middle you have another section, contrasted somehow, perhaps in orchestral texture or in dynamic, and that section also perhaps contrasting in key, serving as a central point. A, B, A. Minuet, trio, minuet. Musical classicism, then, is a corollary in sound to classical architecture, as one can commonly see in referring to pictures of the classical arch. In the classical arch, we have a facade pattern equal to the musical one. The passage of time as our eye progresses across the front of that building, divided into equal sections by the columns, a midpoint of articulation to which the flow goes and from which it departs. A total structure, then, which satisfies us by its equilibrium, by its proportions, and at the same time drives us to a point and away from that point. Something static, something dynamic. And that's what happens in this most basic form of classical music, minuet, trio, minuet. I'd like to show you then at the piano that Mozart minuet again from the Little Night Music. Here's our outer portions, the minuet section. Here is our trio. Now, let me give you those tunes again just to reflect what we were talking about. We're thinking now the first section of the minuet, that is this. A vigorous idea. Which is repeated. Then a contrasting section, contrasting in this case by a turn to a smoother line instead of the more excited gesture of the beginnings. return to the first idea. Thus we have then this total sound for the minuet: action, contrast, action again. The sinful section, or trio, follows the same formal principle, but has an overall contrast to the minuet, either, as I said, in texture or in timbre or in key. And here the overall quality is in a singing style and smooth. That is repeated for an equal time span. We have the contrasting section and a return to the first idea. And then, having achieved the central point of our musical arch, as it were, we are satisfied only by the completion of our initial expectation, namely that first material must return, and by its completion, our musical expectations not only are satisfied, but satisfied in a special way, namely by the return to the initial mood, that initial quality, the departure from which set up those expectations of the need for return. A, B, A, minuet, trio, minuet. The most simple, the most rudimentary, and yet the most important correlation of musical architecture and man's architectural structures in the neoclassical revival. The ease of grasping such an oral model then is the key to an appreciation of much of what musical classicism of the 18th century was all about. Here then is that minuet and trio from the Little Night Music. Now, models are what they are, namely models. I mentioned that one of the points of success to listening to such music is the listener's ability to grasp onto this simple principle. But the ability to appreciate to the full what this music was all about lies also in our ability to grasp what was absolutely necessary for a successful realization of that model as far as the musician is concerned. The ability of a composer to use that model, but to transcend it, to move beyond the simple pattern into something very special, a living musical experience, not just a repetition. And so the intellectual processes of the composer must give to that music freshness and vitality to make every piece live. That gives pleasure to the listener, and in virtuoso ability also gives practice and pleasure to the performer, such as we hear in the music of Scarlatti, played by Lynn Stodola.